The Sister from Appalachia and the Missionary. The story of Jonah and Lydia begins in the mist-shrouded hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, in 1952, a story too faithful to remain human. It is within the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, hidden deep, where cold dust and poverty mixed with isolation and forgotten American dreams, that the Blackwood family's tale unfolds, a tale that science, history, and human morality all struggle to reconcile. Welcome to our documentary channel, where the darkest chapters of human genealogy are uncovered. Our investigation today takes us back to a community where familial lines blurred beyond recognition, creating a legacy of suffering that echoes through generations. The Blackwoods were not always outcasts. Once respectable settlers who arrived during the 1880s coal boom, historical records indicate this. A hard-working miner, Timothy Blackwood, brought his young wife Margaret and their 3 children to these mountains with hopes of prosperity. Instead of prosperity, what they found was a harsh existence where survival meant turning inward. The original Blackwood homestead, by 1925, had been transformed into a compound of small, dilapidated cabins housing over 20 family members across 3 generations. From this period, county records show the Blackwoods had stopped integrating with neighboring communities. The isolation wasn't just geographical, explains local historian Dr. Eliza Cartwright. The Blackwoods developed their own dialect, their own customs, and most concerning, their own interpretation of biblical teachings that justified keeping bloodlines pure within the family. They believed spiritual contamination was carried by outsiders. Haunting images were revealed by archive photographs from a 1932 regional census. Hollow-eyed children with distinctive facial features, pronounced brow ridges, eyes unusually small and set too far apart, and jaw lines that seemed incomplete in their formation. These were the physical manifestations of generations of consanguinity, where genes recycled within the same small pool created increasingly pronounced deformities. Into this environment, Jonah Blackwood was born in 1924, the 3rd son of cousins Elijah and Ruth Ann Blackwood. Despite his physical limitations, a pronounced limp and partial vision loss, local church records indicate Jonah displayed an unusual intelligence. Born in 1926, his sister Lydia suffered more severely with limited cognitive development, yet possessed what family journals described as an angelic singing voice that could tame the wildest mountain creatures. By 1945, World War II had drawn many young men away from Appalachia, but Jonah remained, deemed unfit for military service. As coal mines closed and poverty deepened, most families migrated toward industrial centers. Further into their mountain sanctuary, however, the Blackwoods retreated, their isolation nearly complete. The available medical records from this period were reviewed by Dr. Thomas Harrington, a geneticist specializing in hereditary disorders. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. What we see in the Blackwood lineage is a textbook case of genetic collapse. Recessive traits that would normally remain dormant began expressing themselves with alarming frequency: developmental delays, skeletal malformations, cardiovascular defects. Each generation became progressively more affected. The first outsider to document the Blackwoods in detail was county nurse Evelyn Porter, who in 1949 ventured into the hollow after reports of severely ill children. Her journal, now preserved in the State Historical Archives, describes her initial encounter. The condition of these people defies medical description. Several children appear to be suffering from conditions I've never encountered. Most troubling is their acceptance of these afflictions as God's will rather than preventable outcomes. When Porter attempted to explain the dangers of familial unions, she was driven from the property by Jonah, who by then had assumed a spiritual leadership role within the family. He had begun calling himself the missionary, claiming divine visions that instructed him to preserve what he called the sacred bloodline. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel if you value understanding the hidden truths of American history that shaped our society today. Subscribing is essential. These are the stories conventional education won't teach you. By 1950, Jonah Blackwood's influence over the family had grown into complete authority. At 26, his physical condition had deteriorated, his spine increasingly curved, his vision reduced to shadows and light, yet his charisma seemed inversely proportional to his health. Multiple attempts by social services to check on the welfare of children at the compound are documented in county sheriff reports from this period, all rebuffed, sometimes violently. Jonah's sister, Lydia, had developed into what neighbors described as a creature of otherworldly beauty. Despite her obvious afflictions, her growth had been stunted, leaving her childlike in stature, even at 24. Her intellectual development had plateaued at approximately that of an 8-year-old, according to assessments later conducted. Yet, an unsettling purity to her presence was described by those who encountered her, a radiance that seemed at odds with her genetic misfortunes. A rare photograph recovered from a regional newspaper shows Lydia at a distance sitting on the porch of the main cabin. Even in the grainy black and white image, there's something haunting about her small frame, oversized head, and the way she clutches a rag doll despite her adult age. What makes Jonah and Lydia's story particularly compelling, explains Dr. Margaret Wilkins, a historian of Appalachian religious movements, is how their relationship evolved into something both spiritually and biologically destructive. Jonah's theological innovations created a worldview where their union wasn't just accepted but divinely ordained. A theology cobbled together from misinterpreted biblical passages, local superstitions, and his own fevered imagination is revealed in recovered fragments of Jonah's handwritten sermons. He preached about vessels of purity and the sanctuary of sacred lineage, concepts that justified increasingly closed familial relationships. Folks knew something wasn't right up in that hollow, recalled former neighbor Harold Jenkins, interviewed in 1972. You'd hear singing at odd hours, beautiful but chilling. Sometimes Jonah would come down to trade, always quoting scripture, but twisted in ways that made your skin crawl. The way he talked about his sister, it was something not right there. By 1951, the Blackwood compound had become entirely self-sufficient. They grew their own food, distilled medicine from local plants, and avoided all government services. The property had fallen into serious disrepair, county tax assessors noted, with only Jonah's cabin and the temple, a converted barn, showing signs of maintenance. A pivotal moment occurred in September 1951 when a traveling doctor, James Montgomery, ventured into the hollow after hearing rumors of children in need of medical attention. His subsequent report to county authorities documents what he witnessed. I encountered approximately 15 individuals displaying various stages of physical malformation consistent with generations of inbreeding. Most disturbing was their religious leader, a severely deformed man calling himself Jonah, who introduced a woman as both his sister and his bride. The woman, Lydia, displayed the cognitive capacity of a child but was clearly with child herself. When I attempted to explain the medical dangers of their union, I was escorted from the property at gunpoint. Montgomery's report triggered an investigation that moved with the glacial pace common to isolated rural communities in the era. By the time authorities organized a proper intervention in early 1952, Lydia had already given birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The attending midwife, a cousin from within the family, later testified that both infants exhibited severe deformities, with the boy surviving only 3 days. When close relatives have children, the risk of genetic disorders increases dramatically, Dr. Harrington explains. In cases of sibling reproduction, the genetic overlap is so substantial that the probability of harmful recessive traits manifesting becomes almost inevitable. The surviving female infant likely carried multiple genetic abnormalities. After the birth of the twins and the death of his son, sheriff's reports indicate that Jonah became increasingly erratic. He interpreted these events not as consequences of consanguinity, but as divine tests of faith. He intensified his preaching, declaring that the surviving daughter, whom he named Faith, would become the mother of a purified generation. What's often overlooked in the Blackwood story is the community's complicity through inaction, states community historian Martha Collins, who has compiled oral histories from surrounding areas. Many locals knew what was happening, but viewed the family as beyond help or as fulfilling their own fate. There was a fatalistic attitude toward mountain people that allowed such situations to persist. As winter settled over the mountains in early 1952, the Blackwood compound fell silent. Smoke continued to rise from the cabin chimneys, but no family members ventured into town. Local merchants reported that even Jonah, who occasionally traded handicrafts for supplies, hadn't been seen for nearly 2 months. The bitter February of 1952 marked a turning point in the Blackwood saga. A severe snowstorm isolated the hollow completely for nearly 3 weeks. When the roads finally cleared, county worker Thomas Bailey delivered routine notifications about property taxes to the compound. What he discovered would become the subject of a multi-agency investigation. A scene of profound neglect is described in Bailey's official statement. "I found the outer cabins abandoned, their occupants apparently relocated to the main house and converted barn. When no one responded to my calls, I peered through a window and observed what appeared to be several individuals in poor health. I immediately returned to town to alert authorities." Conditions that shocked even these seasoned professionals were revealed in the subsequent welfare check conducted by Sheriff Robert Aldridge and County Nurse Evelyn Porter. Clinical descriptions that hint at horrors beyond the medical terminology are contained in Porter's medical report, multiple family members exhibiting signs of severe malnutrition and untreated illnesses. For children under 10 years of age with developmental abnormalities consistent with consanguineous parentage. Most concerning is the condition of the female identified as Lydia Blackwood, 26, who appears catatonic, severely malnourished with infected wounds on her arms and legs. Her infant daughter shows signs of failure to thrive. The individual known as Jonah Blackwood has converted the barn into what he terms a temple, Sheriff Aldridge's parallel report noted, containing handwritten religious texts, family genealogical charts emphasizing blood purity, and disturbing images combining religious iconography with what appears to be family portraits. When authorities attempted to remove the most vulnerable family members for medical treatment, they encountered resistance led by Jonah. His appearance had deteriorated significantly, his body weight dangerously low. His speech was slurred, yet his conviction was undiminished. He declared that worldly authorities have no dominion over the chosen bloodline and refused to allow his sister or their child to be examined. "What we see in Jonah's behavior is a complex interaction," explains Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, a psychiatric historian who has studied the case, between possible genetic predispositions to mental illness, extreme religious ideation, and the cognitive effects of malnutrition and isolation. His theology had evolved to a point where medical intervention was seen as spiritual contamination. The standoff ended only when Lydia collapsed, her condition so grave that even family members begged Jonah to allow medical help. From the medical transport, photographs show a woman so physically diminished that paramedics initially mistook her for a child. Her infant daughter, strapped to her chest despite her weakness, displayed the pronounced facial features characteristic of severe genetic disorders. The medical team's findings are documented in hospital records from Welsh Community Hospital. Patient Lydia Blackwood presents with multiple health crises requiring immediate intervention. Beyond severe malnutrition, she exhibits infected wounds consistent with self-harm rituals described by family members. Developmental abnormalities consistent with generations of consanguinity and psychological trauma manifesting as near-complete dissociation. I need you to pause for a moment and think about what you've just heard. If the truth of this story has moved you, please leave a comment. May God's light reach even the darkest hollows. Your words acknowledge that even in the most isolated places, humanity deserves compassion and understanding. The infant, estimated to be approximately 3 months old, was immediately placed in emergency foster care. Multiple congenital abnormalities were revealed by medical examination, including a heart defect requiring surgical intervention, skeletal malformations, and neurological impairments. This child represents the tragic endpoint of generations of genetic isolation, noted the attending physician. While Lydia received treatment, authorities returned to the compound to find Jonah had barricaded himself in the temple with several loyal family members. A tense negotiation lasting nearly 36 hours is what followed. Sheriff Aldridge, recognizing the potential for violence, enlisted local pastor William Harrison to communicate with Jonah. The disturbing ideology that had consumed the Blackwood patriarch is revealed in Harrison's subsequent statement. He spoke of divine bloodlines and vessels of purity. He showed me journals tracing the Blackwood lineage back generations with each consanguineous union marked with religious symbols. Most disturbing was his insistence that his union with his sister represented the culmination of a divine plan generations in the making. The standoff ended not with surrender but with discovery. When no movement was observed for over 12 hours, authorities entered to find Jonah and 3 adult male relatives deceased from what appeared to be a self-administered herbal concoction. A mixture of local plants known to be toxic, including water hemlock and foxglove, would later be identified by medical examination. The remaining family members, removed to safety and medical care, presented a spectrum of health issues consistent with generations of inbreeding. What we see in cases like the Blackwoods is a gradual accumulation of genetic damage, Dr. Harrington explains. Each consanguineous generation increases the expression of recessive disorders, creating a cascade of health problems that become increasingly severe. News of the Blackwood compound quickly faded from local headlines, deliberately downplayed by county officials concerned about the region's reputation. The surviving family members were dispersed to various care facilities, their true identities often obscured to protect them from public curiosity and shame. For nearly 6 months, Lydia Blackwood's hospital stay extended as doctors addressed her physical ailments and psychiatrists attempted to understand and treat her profound psychological trauma. Hospital records indicate she spoke rarely, but when she did, it was often to sing hymns or recite passages from Jonah's handwritten religious texts. New challenges were brought by the spring of 1953 as authorities grappled with the futures of the surviving Blackwood family members. The complexities of addressing a situation with few legal precedents are revealed in court records. The court finds itself in uncharted territory, noted Judge Howard Williamson, presiding over the case, regarding the placement of individuals whose very existence raises profound questions about social welfare, mental competency, and the limits of family autonomy. Lydia Blackwood, physically recovered but psychologically fragile, was deemed legally incompetent and transferred to Green Valley State Hospital, a mental health facility where she would remain for over 2 decades. A woman existing in a liminal space between lucidity and delusion is described in psychiatric evaluations from this period. Patient continues to reference religious doctrines established by her deceased brother partner, particularly regarding blood purity and divine lineage. While cooperative with basic care, she becomes agitated when separated from her handmade dolls, which she refers to as her children and treats with maternal attention. One of the most ethically complex aspects of this case is represented by the fate of Faith Blackwood, the surviving infant daughter of Jonah and Lydia. Born with multiple congenital abnormalities, she required specialized medical care that strained the resources of local facilities. Court records indicate that after her emergency surgeries, she was transferred to Children's Home Society of West Virginia, where adoption prospects were considered minimal due to her ongoing medical needs and uncertain prognosis. Faith Blackwood becomes essentially invisible in the system after 1953, explains Dr. Wilkins, who has tracked the bureaucratic paper trail of the case. Her records were heavily redacted, likely to protect her from the stigma of her origins. This was common practice for children born of incestuous relationships, especially in cases receiving public attention. The remaining Blackwood family members, approximately 12 adults and 7 children, were evaluated for potential reintegration into society. The challenges they faced are documented in county welfare reports: limited education, socialization deficits, health issues related to consanguinity, and deeply ingrained religious beliefs that viewed outside society with suspicion. The Blackwood case exemplifies how isolation, geographic, social, and eventually genetic, create cycles nearly impossible to break, notes historian Dr. Cartwright. Even after intervention, many family members struggled to adapt to life outside their hollow. Some eventually returned to the mountains, though not to the original compound, which had been condemned. The Blackwood property itself became the subject of academic interest in the late 1950s when anthropologist Dr. Samuel Richardson gained permission to document the compound before its demolition. Buildings reflecting both poverty and purpose are described in his field notes. The main house, though dilapidated, contains evidence of deliberate organization around Jonah's religious principles. Family sleeping quarters are arranged hierarchically with proximity to Jonah's room apparently indicating spiritual status. The most disturbing artifacts are contained in the converted barn temple: hand-drawn charts tracing pure bloodlines, journals detailing theological justifications for consanguinity, and crude medical implements suggesting home births and treatments. Now held in university archives, Richardson's photographs show a community designed for self-sufficiency and isolation. Gardens, though overgrown, once provided food. A small schoolhouse contained religious texts and basic primers, suggesting some attempt at education, albeit heavily filtered through Jonah's worldview. Perhaps most poignant was Richardson's discovery of a hidden room in the main house containing children's drawings, toys, and what appeared to be lesson plans in Lydia's handwriting. These artifacts suggest that despite her limitations, she attempted to create normalcy for the compound's children, even as the genetic consequences of isolation manifested in their development. By 1957, public memory of the Blackwood case had largely faded. However, medical professionals continued to study the case for its implications for genetic counseling and rural healthcare access. The Blackwood case exemplifies the perfect storm of factors leading to genetic collapse within isolated populations, observed Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery, writing in the Journal of Rural Medicine in 1958. Geographic barriers, cultural separation, religious justification, and generational reinforcement of practices harmful to genetic diversity. Similar patterns can be observed in other isolated communities, though rarely with such extreme theological reinforcement. In 1962, a follow-up study attempted to locate and assess former Blackwood family members. Of the 19 identified survivors, only 11 could be located. Their outcomes varied dramatically. Some had integrated into mainstream society with ongoing support, while others had returned to isolated rural living, though not in communal arrangements. 3 had died from complications related to congenital disorders. Even a decade later, the genetic legacy of this family's isolation remains evident, noted public health nurse Margaret Wilson, who participated in the follow-up study, in her report. Those who have achieved relative independence still struggle with health issues requiring ongoing medical intervention. Most troubling are indications that some have concealed their family history from new communities, raising concerns about continued genetic risks. Faith Blackwood's path remained deliberately obscured in official records. Cross-referencing medical files and adoption records suggests she remained in institutional care throughout her childhood, her medical needs too substantial for foster placement. A brief notation in a 1970 caseworker's report mentions a female ward with background of genetic complications, now age 18, transitioned to adult supportive living facility. In the summer of 1972, journalist Robert Campbell began researching Appalachian communities for a planned book on rural poverty. During interviews with elderly residents of McDowell County, he repeatedly encountered references to the Blackwood situation. Intrigued, Campbell began piecing together the long-forgotten story. His investigation led him to Green Valley State Hospital, where Lydia Blackwood had resided for nearly 20 years. Hospital administrator, Dr. James Wilson, initially refused access, citing patient privacy, but eventually allowed a limited interview after Campbell obtained written permission from Lydia's court-appointed guardian. A rare glimpse of Lydia in her later years is provided by Campbell's notes from this encounter. Patient appears significantly older than her 46 years. Physical manifestations of consanguinity remain evident: unusually small stature, distinctive facial features, limited motor coordination. She speaks softly, often drifting between coherent responses and religious recitations. When I mention her brother Jonah, she corrects me, "My husband in the eyes of the Lord. We were chosen vessels." The most revealing moment came when Campbell asked about her daughter. According to his notes, Lydia became briefly lucid: "They took my faith. She was perfect in God's design, even if broken in man's eyes. I sing to her still, and sometimes she answers in the wind." Dr. Wilson later confided to Campbell that Lydia maintained an elaborate fantasy that her daughter lived in a special place for chosen ones and would eventually return to continue the sacred bloodline. In reality, medical records indicated Faith Blackwood had died in 1967 at age 15 from complications related to her congenital heart condition. Campbell's research expanded to include interviews with former social workers, medical professionals, and law enforcement officers involved in the case. A picture of a system ill-equipped to address the complex intersection of isolation, religious extremism, and generations of consanguinity is painted by their collective recollections. "We knew something wasn't right up in that hollow for years before we went in," recalled former Sheriff's Deputy Thomas Grant, "but back then, mountain families were left to themselves unless something criminal happened. Looking back, I wish we'd intervened sooner. Those children never had a chance at normal lives." Reviewing Campbell's findings from a genetic perspective, Dr. Harrington notes, "The Blackwood case represents an extreme but instructive example of genetic isolation. After approximately 5 generations of consanguineous unions, the family manifested nearly every associated risk: increased infant mortality, expressed recessive disorders, developmental abnormalities, and reduced immune function. Their religious rationalization merely accelerated a biological tragedy already in motion." In October 1974, Lydia Blackwood passed away at age 48 from complications of early-onset dementia, a condition potentially linked to her genetic background. Hospital records indicate she remained fixated on her brother's religious teachings until her death, often singing hymns and reciting passages from memory, even as other cognitive functions failed. A small wooden box was discovered among her few possessions after her death. It contained handwritten letters never sent to her daughter, crude dolls made from hospital linens, and a family tree drawn in her childlike hand. The document traced the Blackwood lineage through multiple generations of cousin marriages, sibling unions, and other consanguineous relationships, each marked with religious symbols similar to those found in Jonah's temple decades earlier. The original Blackwood property, abandoned since 1952, was eventually reclaimed by the forest. Former Blackwood compound, now unrecognizable as human habitation, noted a 1980 county survey. Structures collapsed, vegetation overgrown. Only stone foundations and scattered artifacts indicate previous occupation. Local attitudes toward the Blackwood story evolved over time. While initially treated as a shameful secret, by the 1990s the case had become the subject of academic study in fields ranging from rural sociology to genetic counseling. The Blackwood case now serves as a cautionary example in medical ethics courses and public health training for rural practitioners, observes Dr. Cartwright. What was once hidden is now studied to prevent similar tragedies. Campbell's research never resulted in his planned book. "The more I learned about the Blackwoods, the less comfortable I felt sensationalizing their story," he explained in a 1985 interview. "These were human beings caught in a trap of isolation, poverty, and misguided faith, not curiosities for public consumption." The genetic legacy of the Blackwood family continues in medical literature, though names are changed to protect descendants who may have integrated into surrounding communities. A 2010 study examining patterns of rare genetic disorders in Appalachia noted several cases likely connected to the original Blackwood lineage, suggesting their genetic isolation created ripple effects spanning generations. In 2015, developmental psychologist Dr. Rebecca Williams interviewed elderly residents who had attended school with Blackwood children in the 1940s. Their recollections provide context for how the family's isolation deepened. They came to school dirty and strange-looking. Kids were cruel, called them hollow creatures and worse. Eventually they stopped coming altogether. Their father said God would teach them instead. Looking back, I realize we pushed them further into isolation when we could have been a lifeline. Today, the former Blackwood property sits within the boundaries of a national forest, its specific location deliberately omitted from historical markers. Hikers occasionally report finding remnants of stone foundation, rusted tools, fragments of handwritten papers weathered beyond legibility, but most pass by unaware of the human tragedy that unfolded there. A powerful reminder of how isolation, physical, cultural, genetic, can distort human development and belief systems is served by the story of Jonah and Lydia Blackwood. Their misinterpretation of faith, combined with generations of consanguinity, created conditions where biological tragedy became inevitable. Yet behind the sensational aspects lies a deeply human story of people seeking meaning, belonging, and purpose, however misguided their methods. If you've watched all the way through, you clearly appreciate the depth and reality of these historical investigations. Please leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know who truly values these in-depth stories on the channel." Don't forget to subscribe for more hidden chapters of American history that shaped our society in ways conventional education never addresses. Like this video if you found it informative and share it with others who appreciate understanding the complex truths of our shared past. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light.